The first thing I ever killed was a landmine. Not with a rifle from 100 yards, but up close, on my hands and knees, with nothing but a digging tool and the sweat dripping from my nose. For 20 years, as a combat engineer, my job was to find the hidden things that were designed to tear people apart. I was good at it. I was good at seeing the subtle disturbances in the earth, the patch of ground that was just a little too perfect. When you spend your life looking for buried threats, you get a sixth sense for when something isn't right. It's a sense that's hard to turn off, even when you're retired, especially when you've moved somewhere specifically to find peace. The brochure for Willow Creek Meadows promised exactly that. It showed smiling families, manicured gardens, and a crystal-clear lake under a perpetually sunny sky. It was a master-planned community built on the principles of ecological harmony and neighborly respect. It was, in short, everything my life in the service had not been. After my wife passed, the silence in our old house was deafening. I needed a new mission, and that mission was tranquility. My only companion was Buster, a 10-year-old golden retriever with a heart bigger than his brain. We were going to grow old together, take long, slow walks, and I was going to finally build the ship-in-a-bottle collection I'd always dreamed of. No more buried threats, no more looking for the thing that was wrong. The man who sold me this dream was Arthur Vance. He wasn't just a developer. He was the visionary, the founder, the benevolent king of Willow Creek. He had silver hair, a smile that could disarm a hostile nation, and he spoke in TED Talk-ready sound bites about sustainability and community. He even hosted a welcome barbecue for new residents himself.
"Mark, welcome,"
He'd said, shaking my hand with a grip that was both firm and fatherly. "We're so glad to have a veteran here, a man who appreciates order and discipline. You'll find we run a tight ship at Willow Creek, and that's why our property values and our quality of life are second to none." He called it a tight ship. I would later come to call it a prison camp with better landscaping. The rules were extensive. No unapproved vegetable gardens. Lawn height to be maintained between 2 and 2.5 inches. All exterior paint colors must be chosen from the pre-approved Earth and Harmony palette. It was petty, but I figured it was a small price to pay for the promised peace. I'd followed far more ridiculous orders in my career. For the first month, it was perfect. Buster and I established our walking routine. I met a few neighbors who, while a bit reserved, seemed pleasant enough. I started on my first ship, a particularly tricky 18th century frigate. Then Buster started getting sick. At first, it was just lethargy. Then he lost his appetite. Our vet ran every test imaginable. Blood work, scans, allergies. Everything came back inconclusive. "It's almost like he's been exposed to some kind of low-grade toxin, Mark," Dr. Evans said, scratching his head. "Something environmental. Have you changed his food? Used any new chemicals on your lawn?" I hadn't. Willow Creek had its own landscaping crews who used only organically certified products. That, when the old training kicked in, the sense that something was wrong. I started observing, not like a retiree enjoying the view, but like a sapper looking for the tripwire. I noticed the landscaping crews never aerated the soil. They just laid new turf over the old. I noticed that certain patches of my lawn, despite the constant care, were always a sickly shade of yellow. One afternoon, armed with a simple soil testing kit I'd bought online, I walked to one of the yellow patches. The ground felt unnaturally compacted. I pushed the small coring tool into the earth. It was barely 2 inches down when it hit something hard with a dull clink. Not a rock. It felt metallic. I started to dig around it with a small trowel. Before my fingers could touch it, a golf cart screeched to a halt on the sidewalk behind me. "Mr. Thompson, what do you think you're doing?" The voice was sharp accusatory.
It was Daniel, Arthur Vance's right-hand man and the head of the HOA's Compliance Committee. He was a man in his 30s who wore his authority like a cheap suit. It didn't quite fit, and it made him look ridiculous. "I'm taking a soil sample," I said calmly. "My dog is sick. The vet thinks it might be something in the ground." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He looked from my trowel to the small hole in the lawn, as if I just tried to tunnel out of a POW camp. "Article 7, Section 4 of the Willow Creek Covenant," he recited from memory. "No resident shall perform any unauthorized excavation, alteration, or disturbance of community-managed landscaping. This includes, but is not limited to, digging, rototilling, and aerating." I stared at him, then at the tiny hole in my lawn. "I'm digging a 3-inch hole, Daniel. I think the structural integrity of the community will survive." "That's a $50 fine for the unauthorized excavation," he said, tapping on a small tablet, "and a $100 fine for display of uncooperative attitude toward committee member." He wasn't joking. The next morning, a crisp white envelope was in my mailbox. Inside were 2 invoices from the HOA. One for $50 for unauthorized landscape alteration, the other for $100 for display of uncooperative attitude toward committee member. I felt a cold anger I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood looking nice. This was about something else. That evening, I waited until well after midnight. Under the dim glow of a crescent moon, I went back to that same spot on the lawn.
This time I brought a larger spade and a flashlight. The old instincts were screaming at me now. The perfectly manicured lawn, the rule against digging. It was the patch of ground that was just a little too perfect. I dug carefully, methodically, clearing the soil away from the object. It was a small, rusted metal drum, no bigger than a coffee can. As I worked it loose from the earth, a faint, acrid chemical smell hit my nostrils. It was a smell I hadn't encountered in years, not since a cleanup operation in a bombed-out industrial plant overseas. My blood ran cold. I sealed the drum in a heavy-duty plastic bag and took it to my garage. My mission for tranquility was officially over. A new one had just begun. My garage, once a sanctuary for my shipbuilding hobby, became a makeshift lab. The metal drum sat on my workbench under a harsh fluorescent light. Using a set of precision tools I'd kept from my service days, I carefully scraped away some of the rust and dirt. There were no markings, no serial numbers, nothing to identify its origin. But I didn't need a label. The smell was enough. It was a cocktail of industrial solvents, probably chlorinated hydrocarbons, stuff that was banned decades ago for being carcinogenic. The kind of toxic waste that corporations paid a fortune to get rid of legally, or a much smaller fortune to make disappear illegally. Burying a few drums on a piece of undeveloped land was a classic cost-cutting measure from the old days. But this wasn't just undeveloped land anymore. This was Willow Creek Meadows. People lived here. Kids played on these lawns. Pets, like my Buster, were getting sick. My first instinct was to call the EPA, the police, someone with a badge and the authority to shut this whole place down. But my training held me back. When you're clearing a minefield, you don't just charge in. You assess. You gather intel. You understand the full scope of the threat before you take a single step. Charging in gets people killed. I had a sample. I needed it analyzed by an independent lab, someone with no connection to Vance or his empire. My late wife's nephew, David, was a chemistry professor at the State University. I made a call. I didn't give him the details, just told him I had a soil sample from my garden that I was concerned about and asked if he could run it through a mass spectrometer for me, off the books. He agreed, no questions asked. The next day, I tried to approach Arthur Vance. I wanted to see his face when I brought it up, to gauge his reaction. I found him near the community clubhouse, overseeing the installation of a new bronze statue of a soaring eagle. He was the picture of a proud patriarch. "Arthur," I began, keeping my tone neutral, "I had a question about the history of this land before it was developed." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes became instantly guarded. It was farmland, Mark, owned by the same family for generations. We bought it and turned it into the paradise you see today. Why do you ask? I decided to be direct. My dog is sick. The vet thinks it's environmental. I found something buried in my yard, a small metal container. I watched him closely. There was no flicker of surprise, no concern, just a smooth, practiced pivot. That's why we have rules against digging, Mark. Old farms can have all sorts of junk buried in them. An old oil can, a piece of a tractor. That's precisely why we brought in thousands of tons of fresh, clean topsoil to build these lawns, to ensure a pristine environment for everyone. It was a perfect answer. Plausible, reassuring, and a complete lie. He was telling me that whatever I found was an isolated piece of junk and that the topsoil was my protection. But the drum I found was buried in the topsoil, not under it.
It had been put there much more recently. I'd feel better if the HOA's environmental consultant could take a look at it, I pushed, for my peace of mind. Vince's smile finally tightened. Our consultants have certified this entire property as perfectly safe. We have binders full of reports. Frankly, I'm a little disappointed. We expect a certain level of trust from our residents here. Causing a panic over a rusty piece of farm equipment would be unneighborly. The word hung in the air, unneighborly. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of community. He was telling me to drop it. As I walked away, I saw him speaking quietly to Daniel, who shot a venomous glare in my direction. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I received 3 new HOA violations, one for my garden hose being coiled in a non-standard spiral, another because the American flag I flew from my porch was, according to their measurements, 2 inches shorter than the mandated size. The third was for loitering with intent to scrutinize community property, which I gathered meant I was seen looking too closely at my own lawn.
They were trying to bury me in paper, to annoy me into submission. They were treating me like a grumpy old man who couldn't follow the rules. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had spent 2 decades meticulously documenting threats. I started my own surveillance. Early mornings, before the sun came up, I'd walk Buster along the perimeter of the development. I carried a walking stick, a sturdy oak staff my son had carved for me. It had a steel tip. As I walked, I'd probe the ground in areas that looked suspicious, patches of discolored grass, areas of subsidence, places near drainage ditches. Clink, clink, clink. They were everywhere, not just on my property, but scattered across the entire community. I marked each location on a satellite map on my phone, using a simple coding system. While probing near the lake one morning, a woman named Eleanor, who lived 3 houses down, stopped to talk. I knew her husband had passed away a year ago. "How's your lovely dog doing?" she asked, her eyes full of genuine concern. "He's been sick," I admitted. "The vet's not sure why." Her face fell. "I'm so sorry to hear that. I had to put my Cocker Spaniel, Daisy, to sleep about 6 months ago. The vets were baffled. Her liver just gave out." A cold knot formed in my stomach.
I'm sorry for your loss, Eleanor. Thank you. The strangest thing is, half a dozen dogs on this street have had serious health problems in the last 2 years. Cancers, liver failure, all very aggressive. The HOA sent around a memo attributing it to a rare local fungus. They offered to cover half the vet bills for anyone affected, as long as we signed a waiver. A waiver? Hush money. A gag order disguised as generosity. She had no idea she'd just handed me a key piece of the puzzle. They knew. They'd known for years. They had a protocol in place to manage the casualties. That evening, David called. His voice was grim. "Mark, what the hell did you send me? This sample is hotter than a $2 pistol. It's a toxic soup of tetrachloroethylene,
and other industrial degreasers. This isn't farm runoff. This is industrial waste, and at a concentration that's, well, it's high enough that you shouldn't be handling it without a hazmat suit. Whatever you do, don't tell me where you got it, because I think I have a legal and ethical duty to report this to the EPA. The confirmation was a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about my dog anymore. This was about Eleanor's dog. It was about every family living on this poisoned land. I pulled up the satellite map on my computer. The points where I'd found the metallic clinks formed a distinct pattern.
They weren't random. They followed the gentle curve of the underground irrigation lines. My blood froze. They hadn't just buried the drums, they had weaponized the irrigation system. Every time the sprinklers came on, they were slowly, deliberately leaching these poisons into the pristine topsoil, spreading it evenly across every single lawn in Willow Creek Meadows. It wasn't an old industrial accident. This was a modern, ongoing, and intentional act of mass poisoning. The knowledge landed with the force of a physical blow. The sprinklers, those symbols of suburban perfection that hissed to life every morning in a synchronized ballet, were a poison delivery system. Every droplet of water that nourished the unnaturally green lawns was carrying a microscopic death sentence. I looked out my window at my neighbors. I saw Mrs. Gable next door, tending to her prize-winning roses. I saw the Henderson kids, two young boys, wrestling on their front lawn, their faces pressed into the toxic grass. They were all living in a minefield, completely oblivious, and Arthur Vance had sold them the tickets. My training separated the mission into two clear objectives. First, document the dispersal pattern and gather irrefutable proof. Second, build a small, reliable team.
You never go into a hot zone alone. For the first objective, I needed the irrigation blueprints. I went to the HOA community office, a sterile building with Vance's smiling portrait on the wall, and put in a formal request. My cover story was that I was planning to install a French drain to deal with a soggy patch in my backyard and needed to know where the main lines were. Daniel was at the counter. He looked at my request form with theatrical suspicion. A French drain? That's a major alteration, Mark. That will require a multi-stage approval process, architectural reviews, and an environmental impact study. He was enjoying this, the petty power of obstruction. Fine, I said, not taking the bait. Just give me the schematic from my own records for now. I'll start the paperwork. He couldn't deny a homeowner access to basic property information. He printed a copy, but not before using a thick black marker to redact everything outside my specific property line. It was a useless gesture. I only needed to see the pattern on my own lot to confirm my theory. That night, I scanned the blueprint and overlaid my own map of the buried drums. It was a perfect, horrifying match. The drums were buried at the junctions of the main irrigation lines, positioned to slowly corrode and leak their contents directly into the water flow. My next step was Eleanor. I found her sitting by the lake, throwing breadcrumbs to the ducks. I sat on the bench, leaving a respectful distance. I didn't start with poison or cancer. I started with money. Eleanor, I began gently, I was looking at the HOA's annual budget. It's public record. Did you know that over 60% of our fees go to one company, Vance Ecological Landscaping? She shrugged. Arthur owns it, doesn't he? He said it saves the community money by keeping it in-house. It doesn't, I said. I made some calls. The rates they charge the HOA are nearly double the industry standard. We're being fleeced. I saw a spark of anger in her eyes. It was the entry point I needed. And that waiver you signed about Daisy? I continued. I had a lawyer friend look at it. It's not just a waiver. It's a non-disclosure agreement. You're legally barred from discussing your dog's illness with other residents or the media. Doesn't that seem strange to you? For a fungus? She stopped throwing crumbs. Her hands were trembling. What are you saying, Mark? I'm saying this isn't about a fungus. It's about a cover-up. I told her everything. About Buster, the drum, the lab results. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally, a hardened resolve. She thought of Daisy, and the pieces clicked into place. I had my first recruit. While Eleanor began discreetly talking to other bereaved pet owners, I focused on the bigger picture. This operation was too slick for just Vance and his lapdog Daniel. I cashed in a portion of my retirement savings and hired a man I'll call Stinger. He was a former military intelligence analyst I'd served with, who now ran a private security and investigation firm. His specialty was following the money. While Stinger dug into the corporate maze, the harassment campaign against me intensified. It was no longer just fines. I came out one morning to find my car's tires slashed. The next day, Buster had a violent seizure. We rushed him to the vet, his small body convulsing in the back of my car. Dr. Evans managed to stabilize him, but the prognosis was grim. His liver values are off the charts, Mark. It's acute chemical poisoning. Whatever he was exposed to, he got another, larger dose. My blood ran hot with fury. They had come onto my property. They had directly targeted my dog.
I checked the small, covert security cameras that installed after the hose incident. The footage from the previous night showed a dark figure slipping into my backyard and pouring a liquid from a can along the fence line where Buster liked to sniff. The figure was wearing a hoodie, but he had a distinctive limp. It was Daniel. The message was clear. Drop it, or the next dose would be for me. I sent the footage to Stinger. 2 days later, he called. "You're not going to believe this, Mark. Vance Ecological Landscaping is a subsidiary of a shell corp, which is owned by another, all registered in Delaware. But I cracked it. The money isn't just coming from the HOA. They're getting massive payments, 8 figures, from Axion Chemical." The name hit me like a physical shock. Axion was a corporate behemoth with a legacy of environmental disasters they'd managed to bury with high-priced lawyers. "What's the connection?" I asked, my voice tight. "The land Willow Creek is built on," Stinger explained. "It wasn't a quaint family farm. It was an Axion Chemical buffer zone for one of their old manufacturing plants. It was so contaminated with industrial runoff that the EPA designated it a brownfield site, unfit for development."
But the designation mysteriously vanished from the public record about 10 years ago, right before Vance bought it for pennies on the dollar. The whole sickening picture snapped into focus. Vance didn't just stumble upon a toxic dump, he was the cleanup crew. Axion had paid him a fortune to acquire the poisoned land and make their massive environmental liability disappear. His solution was monstrous in its genius. Build a luxury community on top of it and use the residents' own HOA fees to fund a landscaping program that would slowly, over decades, disperse the toxins across the entire property. He was being paid by the polluter to hide the crime, and he was being paid by the victims to poison them. He wasn't just a crooked developer, he was a professional launderer of industrial waste. I looked out the window at the centerpiece of our community, the beautiful man-made lake. It was where the irrigation system's runoff ultimately ended up. For years, every drop of poisoned water from every lawn had been slowly collecting in that one basin. The toxins weren't just in the soil. They had been concentrating in that lake, settling into the sediment, being absorbed by the fish and the wildlife.
I thought of the community flyers I'd seen tacked up in the clubhouse. The annual Willow Creek Summer Splash, a family event with swimming, fishing, and a barbecue on the shore. It was scheduled for this Saturday. Today was Tuesday. An entire community of children was about to spend a day swimming in a concentrated pool of carcinogenic waste. The clock was ticking. The Summer Splash. The name itself felt like a sick joke. I had 4 days to stop an entire community from celebrating on the shores of a chemical waste pond. My first impulse was the engineer's impulse: demolition. Find the main water intake for the lake and shut it down. But that was a temporary solution that would only raise questions and give Vance time to spin a new set of lies. Calling the EPA was the by-the-book play. But Stinger's warning echoed in my head. Axion Chemical had made a federal EPA designation disappear once before.
Their lawyers could tie my unofficial lab results up in court for weeks, maybe months. By then, the evidence could be disturbed, the narrative hopelessly muddied, and who knows how many more people would get sick. No, this couldn't be a bureaucratic battle. It had to be a public execution. I needed to expose Vance so thoroughly, so publicly, that no lawyer or paid-off politician could save him. And the perfect stage was his own party. I went back to Eleanor. I laid out the full scope of the Axion conspiracy and the immediate threat of the lake. The color drained from her face. She had taken her own grandchildren fishing there just last month. The grief in her eyes hardened into a diamond-hard fury. "What do you need, Mark?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "I need a third person," I said. "Someone who knows the guts of this place, the plumbing, the electrical, the infrastructure. Someone who's been here a while and has a reason to be angry." Eleanor nodded slowly. George Miller. He was one of the first residents here. He was a master plumber for the city for 40 years before he retired.
He lost his wife, Martha, about 3 years ago. A rare, fast-acting form of leukemia. The doctors couldn't explain it. We met George in his workshop, a meticulously organized space filled with tools and copper piping. He was a quiet, thoughtful man with hands like worn leather. I told him the same story I told Eleanor. I showed him the lab results and my map of the drums. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at a photo of a smiling, white-haired woman on his workbench. "Martha loved her garden," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She was out there every day, her hands in the soil." He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw the same cold fire I felt in my own gut. That bastard Vance sent a $3,000 floral arrangement to her funeral. He whispered, "What do you need me to do?" That night, the three of us formed our small council of war in George's soundproofed workshop. We were 2 old soldiers and a grieving widow, an unlikely battalion against a corporate giant. My role was strategy and evidence. Eleanor's was communication. She would use the HOA's own phone tree to discreetly build a network of residents who had been affected, telling them only that they needed to be at the summer splash for a special community announcement.
George's role was technical operations. The entire irrigation system, including the feeder line for the lake, is run from a single pump house near the main gate, he explained, sketching a diagram on a piece of plywood. It's a concrete bunker, one master control panel. The door has a standard tumbler lock, but also a magnetic security keypad. I know the model. I can bypass the tumbler, but the keypad logs every entry. If we go in, they'll know. Then they can't know it's us, I said. Daniel does a security sweep in his golf cart every night between 1 and 2 a.m. We'll go in right behind him. He'll be our alibi. He'll have just certified the building as secure. The next night was moonless, perfect for our operation. We wore dark clothing, our faces grim. As we saw the distant headlights of Daniel's golf cart complete its loop, we moved. George was a magician with the lock. A few clicks with his tension wrench and the tumbler gave way. He pulled a small device from his pocket and placed it over the keypad.
"It'll interrupt the signal to the login system for 60 seconds, he whispered. "Go." Inside, the pump house hummed with latent power. On the wall was a massive schematic of the entire community's water systems, far more detailed than the one Daniel had given me. But the real prize was on a small desk in the corner, a maintenance logbook. I flipped through the pages, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. It was all there, in black and white. Monthly system flushes. Entries detailing dosing adjustments to the water supply. Notes about accelerated soil saturation in specific zones, zones that corresponded perfectly with the properties of residents who had complained or been forced out. And then I found the smoking gun, a work order from 6 months ago, signed by Arthur Vance himself.
It authorized the emergency installation of a high-capacity filtration bypass for the main lake feeder. In plain English, they knew the water feeding the lake was toxic, so they installed a secret pipe to bypass their own filtration system, dumping the poison directly into the lake to avoid contaminating their expensive equipment.
It was premeditated, documented, and signed. I took photos of every single page with my phone. On the way out, George pointed to the main control panel. "This is it," he said, "the kill switch. One button shuts down every sprinkler and every pump in Willow Creek." "Don't touch it," I said. "Not yet. Our weapon isn't turning the water off. It's showing everyone exactly what's in it." We slipped back into the night, unseen, unheard. We now had the final piece of evidence. The plan for Saturday was set. Eleanor had confirmed a large group of residents would be there. Stinger had a media contact from a national news outlet on standby. My part of the plan was simple, direct, and relied on my unique skill set. It was time to go back to my roots. It was time to dig. The day of the summer splash arrived with a cruel, mocking beauty. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. The smell of hot dogs and sunscreen filled the air. Families laid out blankets, children in swimsuits chased each other with water guns, and in the center of it all, Arthur Vance played the part of the benevolent host, his silver hair glinting in the sun. He stood on a small, decorated stage, a microphone in his hand, ready to deliver his welcome address. He had no idea he was standing on a primed bomb, and I was holding the detonator.
I waited by the edge of the woods. The night before, using only a spade in my bare hands, I had carefully unearthed the drum closest to the pavilion, leaving it covered by just a thin, surgically cut piece of turf. As Vance began to speak, his voice booming over the speakers about community and shared values, I started walking. I moved with purpose, not toward him, but toward that specific spot on the lawn. George, positioned discreetly near the pump house, gave me a subtle nod. Eleanor stood with a group of 24 other residents, their faces grimly determined. Vance finally noticed me, an old man in a work shirt marching onto his perfect lawn. He faltered, "Mark, glad you could join us. Perhaps you have a few words to say about our wonderful community?" His voice dripped with condescending poison. I didn't answer. I reached the spot, drove my heel into the ground to mark it, and turned to face the crowd. "He's right," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I do have a few words. I want to talk about what's buried under this paradise." I plunged the shovel into the grass and lifted the prepared square of turf, revealing the rusted metal drum beneath. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Vance's face went white. "This is what killed Eleanor's dog," I declared, my voice rising. "This is what's poisoning our children." As if on cue, Eleanor and her group stepped forward, each holding a framed photo of a beloved pet or a sick family member. Vance screamed for Daniel, for security, but no one came. Suddenly, the cheerful fountains in the middle of the lake sputtered and died as George hit the kill switch, casting an abrupt, eerie silence over the entire party. Vance opened his mouth to shout, to lie, to spin, but it was too late. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A moment later, a wave of chimes and buzzes swept through the crowd as a mass text sent by Stinger arrived on every phone. It contained the photos of the logbook, the work orders, and the damning, undeniable signature of Arthur Vance. The game was over. The sirens in the distance were the closing credits to his reign. I looked at the faces of my neighbors, no longer smiling, their eyes filled with the dawning, terrible understanding. A sapper's job is to find the threats hidden just beneath the surface. My mission was finally complete. The field was clear.